14. Well, you're still around. Yeah. So at least at that long. So when she asked me to come and share here this morning, I thought, what a wonderful opportunity to get out of the city, to come meet another church community. My wife Charmaine is here with me as well, and we appreciate the invitation to be here. As I was sitting there, I was thinking about my little intro about where I'm from, and I thought, oh yeah, this is the other side of the river. And when I was some of you who are older know what I'm talking about, like, I'm from the other side of the river, and that used to be a big deal. It's not as much of a big deal anymore, but it used to be a huge deal. Jan Seed and all that stuff. So, anyways, I'm from a small town called Domaine, which is just 5 miles south of LaSalle. So that's where I grew up. So if that means anything to anybody here, cool. If not, then just know that I grew up in a small town, not unlike this one. Growing up on the farm provided me with many childhood memories that I'm very thankful for. Friends, family, community, a very early faith experience with my parents. My beliefs and my interests and my passions in life developed in that small town. And I'm very thankful to my parents and that town for raising me. Now, while many of these memories are involved in farming, and I did farm with my dad actually till I was 30, a lot of my memories growing up are corrected around sports, which probably doesn't necessarily surprise you. Small town sports. When you play for a small town team, you play against the rival towns. So for me, being from Domaine, Morris, Sanford, Oak Bluff, Starbuck, Rosenort, those are the rival towns. Now, we never went across the river and played on this side. I don't know if you ever went across that side to play anybody, but you know what I'm talking about. So when you play against other small towns, many games you win, many games you lose. Unfortunately, Domaine lost more than we won, but, we did win sometimes. Over the years, you begin to learn the faces and names of these other players. So when you're playing Oak Bluff, there's the Herb Boys, and when you're playing Sanford, it's the Bestlands, and you begin to develop a rivalry with these people. Maybe even begin to, dare I say the word, hate them. They become your rivals. They become your opposition. Maybe even they become your enemies. But an interesting thing happens in small towns. When you get grade 7, you don't stay in the small town because small towns only have elementary schools. So then what they do is they take all the small town kids and they send them to bigger high schools. So guess what happens? You come to this new high school, and all of a sudden you're going to class with all the guys you've been playing against for 6 years. So suddenly, I'm going to Sanford Collegiate in grade 7, and I walk onto the school that day, and lo and behold, staring me right in the face in my class is one of my main rivals from the town of Oak Bluff. His name is Jamie Erb. And he came up to me, first day of school, and he says, "Are you that guy from Domaine with the green helmet?" Yes, my dad bought me a green helmet, and I don't know why, but he did. I was the only guy in the whole league with a green helmet. Anyways, so I'm like, yeah, I'm the guy. And he goes, "We hated playing against you." And then he paused and he says, "But now we're on the same team, and I'm glad we're on the same team." And I was too, because he was very good. So suddenly now my rivals are my teammates. In fact, by the end of grade 7, not only are these rivals and enemies of mine from Oak Bluff and Starbuck and Sanford, my teammates, they're now becoming my friends. And it did take some time to get over things that happened on the ice or on the field. You don't forget those things right away. But once we got to know each other and realized that our skills could work together, we became actually a pretty good team. My junior high years in Sanford, we did pretty well, playing against other towns and other schools. Often, though, when you start thinking about these things, you start thinking, for me, always, I'm a high school Bible teacher, I always bring things back to God's Word. And what I think about is this. One of the challenges we face with the Word of God today is that it's a book that was written 3,000 years ago, 2,000, 3,000 years ago. And to our world today, that's just too old. What would a book from 3,000 years ago have anything to say about 2023? And the crazy thing, not only is it hard to tell people around the world about the Bible, it's actually getting even difficult within the church. A lot of Christian communities are getting confused, I think, and frustrated, I think, about this old book. What do we do about this old book? There's two main messages in this old book. There's the old book called the Old Testament that has God's law in it, the 10 Commandments. And then there's sort of the new old book, which is the New Testament, which is the grace of God through the Christ on the cross. And what we seem to see is that it seems like churches tend to drift towards one or the other. If you look at our world today, especially in the States, but here in Canada too, you can see it happening. It's like grace and law become rivals. and you have to choose sides. You start to think, well, which side am I on? Why can't they work together? So why do we do this? Well, I think it comes down to two simple points. I'm sure you could fill in the blanks for other thoughts you have. On one hand, you have the Old Testament, which is God's law. And if you drift towards that side, it's we have to follow it, and if we don't, we're disobeying God, and we're living dangerously, and our lives are in danger, we're taking risks, we might suffer, and if we teach it and enforce it, or God's wrath will be upon us. On the other side, you have the New Old Law, which is the New Testament with Jesus, and the law is only for the Old Testament. Jesus changed everything. Besides, the Old Testament is too hard to follow. No one could follow it anyway, so therefore it's not really that important anymore. God's love and God's grace through Christ is what saves us, so do your best, and grace will save you. It seems as though those two have become rivals, and they can't seem to work together as teammates. You need to choose one or the other. So how do we connect these two things together? How do we bring the law and grace together? Are they always going to be at odds, or can we find a way to become teammates? So let's journey back to the Old Testament, the people of Israel. They've just crossed the Red Sea. They're now in the shadow of Mount Sinai, the mountain where God first visited Moses a few years earlier, telling him to go free the Israelites in a burning bush. So he left the burning bush and he went to Egypt, and God saved the people, and you guys know the story of the plagues and the crossing the Red Sea. So here they are at Mount Sinai. After they spent 200 years being slaves at least in Egypt, and God helped them grow from 70 people in the family of Jacob to now over 600,000 families. So as they leave Egypt, they leave with wealth, gold, silver, and fancy garments that the Egyptians gave them. And they also now have a calendar to mark their days. The Passover happened in the first month of their new calendar. So here they are at Mount Sinai. They have population, they have wealth, and they have a calendar. So now they need something else. And so God's going to give them what they need, and that is some laws and some rules. How to live together as a nation and how to function as a society in a healthy way. They need guidelines on how to handle property, how to treat each other. So they wait for Moses at the foot of the mountain while he goes up to get the Ten Commandments. Now, I wasn't able to send the video here, so I'll describe the video to you, but I want to share with you this thought. I'm going to go back to being a kid growing up. One of my favorite memories growing up as a kid was that my dad's family was from Domaine. My mom's family was from Saint Eustache. I don't know if anybody here has any idea where that is. And we would drive out there every Thanksgiving or Christmas or Easter, depending on the year, to my grandparents in St. Eustache. And traditionally, we would go there for Easter weekend. And what we would do, my cousins and I, is we'd get together on a couch and some chairs in the living room, and we'd watch the same movie like 12 years in a row. Now, some of you might know what movie's always on every Easter, Ten Commandments. And we'd sit there and we'd watch Charlton Heston get the Ten Commandments from God, the burning God with the fingers of God coming to give them 10 commandments. I will always remember that the rest of my life. So while they're waiting there at the foot of the Mount Sinai, and Moses is getting the 10 commandments with God, while God's up there, what are the people doing? They just crossed the Red Sea. They just saw God do amazing things, and just days later, they're waiting for Moses, and because he doesn't come back after 30 days, they think he's dead. And so they make a golden calf and start bowing down to it. And you sit there going, how is this possible? It's only been 1 month, and they're already abandoning God. After everything God did, how is that possible? We would never do that, would we? Abandon God after a few weeks or months? I don't think the Israelites were unique in this way at all. Anyways, as Moses is coming down the mountain, God warns him what's happened. He gets down there, and Moses kind of loses it. And if you know the story, Moses takes the 10 commandments that God gave him, and what does he do with them? He throws them on the ground, and they shatter into pieces because he's so upset. And then God and Moses do some dealings with the people, and there's some people are dealt with, and some people actually die. And some people sit there and say, well, why would God wipe people out? It seems so vengeful. It seems so angry. Well, if you think of it this way, after everything he had done for them, getting across the Red Sea, how could he not be upset that they were drinking and partying and worshiping a golden calf? In fact, I don't know if you read this or not, but in the golden calf story, there's actually a moment where they say a chant to the golden calf, and they say, this is the God that got us out of Israel. How is that possible? Anyways, did God really want to wipe them out? Well, we can debate that, because apparently he went to Moses and says, you know what, Moses, that's it. I'm starting over. You and me. I'm just going to wipe them out. You and me are starting over. And Moses pleads for him not to do that. I think what God was doing was preparing Moses for the next 40 years. Because for the next 40 years, the people of Israel were going to disappoint Moses day after day after day. Could he handle the disappointment? So yeah, some people say that God's angry and vengeful, but if you actually look at the way he treated the people of Israel, he forgave them so many times. I think the real issue is our forgiving each other, not God forgiving us. If I was God, I would have destroyed them in the desert. They would never have made it to the promised land. I promise you that. Thankfully, I'm not God. God is, and he forgave them. In fact, not only did God forgive them in the desert, he started planning for their ultimate forgiveness. If we go all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, when they're in the Garden of Eden and they mess up, God tells them that her offspring will crush Satan's head. Already there we have the mention of Jesus. So, in the Garden of Eden, we break God's rule. They eat the fruit. There are three main consequences in the Old Testament that we learn about from that. Three things that happen. First of all, now God and humans don't get along. When you and I pray, we're looking at the ceiling, we feel like God can't hear us. We don't connect with God the way we should. Number two, human beings don't get along with each other anymore. People argue with each other. People get mad at each other. People fight all over the world. Marriages and families, violence, cheating, broken relationships. And the third problem is the earth is broken. And now we have thistles. One of my favorite things in Genesis is the word thistle in Genesis 3. I grew up on the farm. I'm going off script here for a second. So when growing up at the farm, my dad one time, we were driving around looking at the fields, and all of a sudden he hammers on the brakes in the truck, pulls at the side of the road, says, I'll be right back. And he starts walking into our canola field, and he walks on like a quarter of a mile into the field. And there, about a quarter of a mile in, you see this one plant that's taller than all the other plants. See, thistles are an interesting plant. They only grow as tall as they need to. So if your crop is this tall, thistles are this tall. If the crop is this tall, they just grow taller than the plants. They're an amazing plant. So the fact that God mentions thistles in the Bible. Anyway, so my dad walks a quarter mile in. He pulls that thistle plant out of the ground. He then carries it back carefully to the truck, because a thistle plant has over 1,000 seeds in the plant. So if you have one plant that blooms and the wind blows the seeds, there's 1,000 thistles the next year. So he carries a thistle and he throws it in the back of the truck and covers it up with a tarp. He sits back in the truck and he looks at me and he says, I hate thistles. Right? I hate thistles. So the earth is broken. The earth is broken. That's why everything doesn't work the way it's supposed to, because the world is broken. So three things are broken. So often as human beings, we like to see ourselves as being gracious and forgiving, and I think we are forgiving, but I think we often forget the fact that most judgment and revenge are about God, are not about God getting us, about us getting each other. We don't get along the way we're supposed to. So we struggle with obeying the law because we want freedom. Those of you who are a little bit younger in the room today, do you like being told what to do by your parents? No. News for you young kids, we don't like being told what to do as adults either. Nobody likes being told what to do. Who wants to, I want to do what I want to do, right? Besides the fact, who decides that the laws are the laws? Who made the laws? Why can't I make my own laws? Why can't I decide for myself what rules I should follow? I mean, look what happened with COVID, right? We don't have to go there, but you know what I'm talking about. The issue ultimately becomes this: who's in charge? Who's in charge of your life? Are we the ones who determine our own destiny? Are we the ones defining right or wrong? Or are we willing to submit to God's law and truth and accept the fact that his design and plan for humanity is the ultimate plan? It's only once we accept his law and his truth and his reality that we can fully understand and appreciate this: how amazing his grace is. How can you appreciate what grace is if you don't know what the law is? If we don't have law, there's no need for grace. There's no need for Jesus dying on the cross if we don't have law. The law reminds us that we need grace. So Moses goes back up the mountain. He pleads with God, don't wipe the people out. And God doesn't. And they move forward towards the promised land. So Moses goes back up the mountain to get a new 10 commandments. Interestingly, the first time God supplied him with the stones and the law, the second time God made Moses chisel out his own pieces of stone and bring them up. I guess that's fair. Moses did break them, so he has to bring up his own set of 10 stones, or 2 sets of stones. So they go to the promised land, they get there in a month, and all of a sudden they have to spend 40 years there, and we know that story, right? That they don't obey God, and God sends them back to the desert. Now, we're going to go back in time again. Well, for some of you, it's only like maybe a year or two, or maybe even this last year. But for the rest of us, it's a long time ago. Think back to when you were in elementary school. Grade 2, grade 3. And it's late October, early November. And you're looking out the window because you're kind of bored. And it's snowing. Think of the first snowfall of the year. If you're in elementary school, that's a very exciting day. And in school, you're all pumped. And you're like, snow! Fantastic! I know right now, this time of year, we don't want to talk about snow, but, you know. And what are you thinking right away? I'm going to go outside for recess and play in the snow. Well, within a minute of that snow falling, you either hear it on the intercom in a bigger school, or if it's a smaller school, the principal comes to your room, and while it's snowing, the principal makes an announcement. Some of you probably know what the announcement is. Just remember, students, don't throw snowballs. Right? Oh. What? Come on. Now, here's the thing. Why did they come and say that? Because they know what you're going to do. Right? But here's the crazy thing. As soon as they tell you don't throw snowballs, what do you want to do? What do you want to do? Throw snowballs, right? Yeah. As soon as they say don't do something, that's what you want to do. So as soon as the principal says don't throw snowballs, you're like, oh, now I really want to throw them. So what happens is the rule being stated makes your mind go to that place where you want to do what they just said. Why is that, right? It's our sinful nature. Our minds go to places we're not supposed to go, right? So the rule being stated triggers in us an interest that seems stronger than before. Why is it that when the law is mentioned, it actually makes us want to do it again or do it more? Is the law a problem? Is the law why we want to do bad things because the law makes us want to do them? Is the law a hindrance? If we get rid of the law, would we actually be better people? If the grace of Christ saves us, do we really need the law anymore? If we just had grace, go ahead and throw snowballs and then, the principal will forgive you, right? Paul talks about this in Romans quite extensively. And Carrie read the passage before about the law. So I don't think I'll read it again, but you heard it. And the battle that goes on inside of us. We know what we should do, and we know what we shouldn't do, but we end up doing what we shouldn't do, and we know we should do, we don't do. And it's a never-ending battle for all of us. And thanks be to God that through Christ we are saved. The battle that rages inside of all of us is something that we realize and we know exists, but we forget. Where we often know what is the right thing to do, we want to do the opposite, even though doing the opposite, while we're doing it, we know we shouldn't be doing it. So it's like in the middle of doing what you shouldn't do, you're like, I shouldn't do this, and you still do it. It's one of the most universally common experiences we all have as human beings. The battle inside of us, deep down, God's law is here in our hearts. We know we shouldn't do things, and we still do it. So what do? Well, Paul reminds us in verse 24 that Christ has already done what we could never do, and that is defeat the power of sin. In Romans 3:23, he says this, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God and are justified freely by his grace through redemption of Christ Jesus. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this, that while we were sinners, he died for us. Since we've now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him?" So, how do we resolve the tension between the law and grace? How do we take these two rivals and bring them together as teammates? So I'm going to give you 4 points to think about today. I know you're supposed to give 3, but I'm going to give you 4. Number 1, God gave us the law. It is a reflection of his perfect holiness. The law is not evil or bad. It is actually a mirror. The law is a mirror that reflects the condition of our hearts. I think the reason why our world doesn't like talking about things like law and sin is because deep down we know it reveals who we really are. It reminds us that we're not holy and that God is. And that there's no way we'll ever keep it. Number 2, God gave us his Son, who brings us the balance. Jesus is the balance between the law and grace. Who does what we can't do? Follow the law perfectly. Who models love and grace to all? Jesus does. Whenever Jesus spoke out against the law, it was the Pharisees' extra laws that he got mad about. He never questioned the law of the Old Testament. What he questioned was the Pharisees. I'm going to give you guys an example of one. Some of you know this, but the Sabbath day walk. The Pharisees had a rule about the Sabbath day walk. You were allowed to walk roughly half a kilometer on the Sabbath. Now, how did the Pharisees come up with half a kilometer? Anybody have a guess? It's pretty bizarre, but so here's how it works. Back in those days, they walked with sandals, with no socks, right? And they'd walk around in their sandals. And the Pharisees figured out that if you walked roughly half a kilometer, you'd pick up enough soil and dirt on your shoes to fill a shovel. And shoveling is work. And therefore, you couldn't walk more than half a kilometer on the Sabbath. If you did, you were working. We live in River Heights. We get offers in our mailbox monthly for people wanting to buy our house. Because Jewish people, we live within half a kilometer of a synagogue. And people want to buy our house so they can walk to synagogue on the Sabbath, the Jewish people, right? That's a law that God did not make. That's a law that man made, right? So Jesus never criticized the Old Testament law. He criticized the Pharisees who added laws to the law, right? Jesus said in Matthew 5, I did not come to abolish the law. I came to fulfill the law. I represent the pure law. Number 3, God created the Old Testament sacrificial system. I teach grade 10 Old Testament studies in high school. And the most challenging part of my grade 10 course every year is talking to grade 10 kids about sacrificing animals. And it's getting harder and harder every year with the world we live in, where animals have now become people, right? If you look at Disney, what has Disney done to animals? Disney has turned animals into human beings who have the same emotions and talk like people. So what happened is the Old Testament was all this sacrificial killing of animals, and it's crazy. Like we to us today, that just sounds insane. Well, why did God do that? Why did God have them go through the sacrificial system? The only way they could be made pure was through the sacrifice of an animal, right? God demonstrated his grace through the law by providing a way out from the law through the sacrificial system. So then Jesus comes along, and what does he become? He becomes the perfect sacrifice. If you don't have the Old Testament sacrificial system, Jesus wouldn't mean anything. It would be the point. You need the Old Testament stories, and you need the Old Testament sacrificial system to make Jesus make sense. He becomes the once for all sacrifice for all of us. And number 4, God sent us the Holy Spirit to lead us in truth. So the Holy Spirit leads us to obey God. In Galatians 5, Paul talks about the fruit of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the flesh need laws. The fruit of the Spirit don't. So all the things that we shouldn't be doing, that there are laws there for, they need to be there because we shouldn't be doing those things. The fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, we don't need laws for that because those are good things. So obeying the law is how we show thankfulness to God for covering our grace. So, now what? We need to live with the law and the grace constantly in view. We need to be willing to live with the tension. We need to be able to live with both. We need to see the value of the law, but we need to also understand that grace matters. We need to have that tension. They need to work together as teammates. Without the law, we wouldn't know what grace was. Without grace, we would have no hope. Together, they are teammates, providing us a guiding light better to see. So let me just wrap up with this, saying it this way to you. God's truth is known through the law. God's love is known through his Son. And God's grace comes through the death and resurrection of his Son. The law and the grace together, perfectly complementary teammates. Thank you.